Hi, and welcome to the Soul and Survival podcast with Grant and Louise Bentley. We have run the Victorian College of Classical Homeopathy since 1995. We are both qualified practicing homeopaths, and Grant is also a naturopath. Together, we discovered a link between energy and facial structure based on traditional ideas from homeopathy that have roots going back 200 years. This project is called Homeopathic Facial Analysis, or HFA for short, and has been the cornerstone of clinical diagnosis and training courses since 1999. Between us, we have written and produced 7 HFA books, including Soul and Survival. Soul and Survival is the philosophy of energy influencing matter and how this energy forms individual facial structure, our unconscious drives and fears, our life patterns, and universal time cycles.
Hi everyone, this is Grant. I hope you enjoy the next few podcasts where I will be revisiting some of my written work and ideas which led me to the development of HFA. I wrote this article many years back, probably nearly 20 years ago, and on revisiting I am happy to say my thoughts as I wrote then still hold up today. Hahnemann, Miasms and Homeopathic Facial Analysis, HFA. The theory of chronic miasms originated from Hahnemann's need to devise a better plan of treatment for patients suffering with chronic disease. The simillimum in acute disease had already proven its worth. Acute diseases such as cholera and scarlet fever, as well as typhus and smallpox, had all been treated successfully with the homeopathic simillimum, yet Hahnemann remained disappointed in the results he was getting in treatment of chronic disease. There was something in the treatment of chronic disease that was lacking in the system. The simillimum should have worked just as effectively for both acute disease and chronic disease, but this was not the case. This began Hahnemann's 12 years of research and writing to produce his book, The Chronic Diseases. In the 1845 preface to the book Chronic Diseases, Constantine Hering wrote, quote, "In his early years, Hahnemann taught that principles of similia and individualization were sufficient to treat all cases of disease. At this time, homeopathy was the simple matching of the symptoms of the patient to the symptoms found in the materia medica. This central doctrine was introduced to rebut the obsession of the orthodox school with removing their one-sided version of the total cause, which was usually related to a disease material somewhere in the body. In its place, the early organon taught the importance of removing the totality of the symptoms of each individual case. It was Hahnemann's failure to permanently cure chronic disease that caused him to reassess his clinical approach. This led to an 11-year study of chronic disease that produced a fundamental change in his views of etiological factors as well as how he viewed the signs and symptoms." End quote. Clearly, Hahnemann made a distinction between treating acute disease with symptom totality and treating chronic disease. In Hahnemann's mind, the two types of disease were not only different in their longevity and action, but were also different in their etiology and therefore required a different strategy of treatment. Symptom totality by itself was not interchangeable. What was missing in the treatment of chronic disease was the inclusion of the underlying dominant miasm into the selection of the remedy. Consider the following quotes by Hahnemann in his book, The Chronic Diseases. Quote, "Why then cannot this vital force, efficiently effected through homeopathic medicine, produce any true and lasting recovery in these chronic maladies, even with the aid of the homeopathic remedies which best cover their present symptoms, while this same force which is created for the restoration of our organism is nevertheless so indefatigably and successfully active in completing the recovery even in severe acute diseases? What is there to prevent this? The answer to this question, which is so natural, inevitably led me to the discovery of the nature of these chronic diseases, to find out then the reason why all the medicines known to homeopathy failed to bring a real cure in the above-mentioned diseases, and to gain an insight more nearly correct and, if possible, quite correct, into the true nature of the thousands of chronic diseases which still remain uncured, despite the incontestable truth of the homeopathic law of cure. This very serious task has occupied me since the years 1816 and 1817 night and day. And behold, the giver of all good things permitted me within this space of time to gradually solve this sublime problem through unremitting thought, indefatigable inquiry, faithful observation, and the most accurate experiments made for the welfare of humanity. The great extent of this is shown in the new symptoms appearing from time to time, so that the homeopathic physician must not hope to permanently heal the separate manifestations of this kind in the presumption hitherto entertained that they are well-defined, separately existing diseases which can be healed permanently and completely. He therefore must first find out as far as possible the whole extent of all the accidents and symptoms belonging to the unknown primitive malady before he can hope to discover one or more medicines which may homeopathically cover the whole of the original disease by means of its peculiar symptoms. By this method he may then be able victoriously to heal and wipe out the malady in its whole extent, consequently also its separate members, that is, all the fragments of a disease appearing in so many various forms. It was a continually repeated fact that the non-venereal chronic diseases, after being time and again removed homeopathically by the remedies fully proved up to the present time, always returned in a more or less varied form and with new symptoms, or reappeared annually with an increase of complaints. This fact gave me the first clue that the homeopathic physician with such a chronic, non-venereal case, yet in all cases of non-venereal chronic disease, has not only to combat the disease presented before his eyes and must not view and treat it as if it were a well-defined disease, to be speedily and permanently destroyed and healed by ordinary homeopathic remedies, but that he has always to encounter only some separate fragment of a more deep-seated original disease." End quote. These quotes are long but important. They are not only interesting, they have far-reaching ramifications with the way we should practice. In the last statement, Hahnemann not only continues to differentiate acute disease from chronic, but he also highlights a difference he believes exists between venereal and non-venereal chronic disease, with the non-venereal being far more complicated and common, which is why he attributed most chronic disease to Sora. The following statements come from the 6th edition of Hahnemann's Organon. Aphorism 79. Quote, "Hitherto syphilis alone has been to some extent known as such a chronic miasmatic disease, which when uncured ceases only with the termination of life. Psychosis, the condylomatous disease, equally ineradicable by the vital force without proper medicinal treatment, was not recognized as a chronic miasmatic disease of a peculiar character, which it nevertheless undoubtedly is, and physicians imagined they had cured it when they had destroyed the growths upon the skin, but the persisting dyscrasia occasioned by it escaped their observation." End quote. Aphorism 80. Quote, Incalculably greater and more important than the two chronic miasms just named, however, is the chronic miasm of Psora, which, while those two reveal their specific internal dyscrasia, the one by the venereal chancre, the other by the cauliflower-like growths, does also, after the completion of the internal infection of the whole organism, announced by a peculiar cutaneous eruption, sometimes consisting only of a few vesicles accompanied by intolerable voluptuous tickling itching and a peculiar odour. The monstrous internal chronic miasm, the Psora, the only real fundamental cause and producer of all the other numerous, I may say innumerable, forms of disease which, under the names of nervous debility, hysteria, hypochondriasis, mania, melancholia, imbecility, madness, epilepsy, and convulsions of all sorts, softening of the bones, rachitis, scoliosis and kyphosis, caries, cancer, fungus, nematodes, neoplasms, gout, hemorrhoids, jaundice, cyanosis, dropsy, amenorrhea, hemorrhage from the stomach, nose, lungs, bladder and womb, of asthma and ulceration of the lungs, of impotence and barrenness, of megrim, deafness, cataract, amaurosis, urinary calculus, paralysis, defects of the senses and pains of thousands of kinds, etc., figure in systematic works on pathology as peculiar independent diseases." End quote. Hahnemann viewed Psora as the deepest, most complex and most common of the chronic miasms. Psora, above all others, was the ultimate chronic disease, which is why, toward the end of his career, he gave sulphur to nearly every patient at some stage in their treatment. Conclusion. The origin of the miasms came from Hahnemann's inability to treat chronic disease with the same reproducible success he could achieve with acute disease. More than a decade of private research led Hahnemann to the conclusion that all chronic diseases had a miasmatic base driving the disease. Hahnemann believed the three chronic miasms were the cause of all humankind's sufferings. Syphilis and psychosis caused untold damage, but Psora was in his mind the deepest and worst of all. His conclusion was that Psora itself, although non-venereal, had its biological origin in leprosy. Over time, due to mismanagement and abuse, leprosy internalized and became so multifaceted that it was no longer recognizable as leprosy itself. Hahnemann's treatment plan for chronic disease directed that the remedy chosen must include the underlying dominant miasm. This meant if Psora was the dominant miasm, then a psoric remedy had to be given. The same applied for both syphilis and psychosis. Hahnemann's conclusions led to the common layers approach of prescribing. In his mind, there was no difference between an inherited miasm and an existing chronic disease. One was a manifestation of the other. For Hahnemann, there was no such thing as arthritis, dementia, or asthma. Each was just a physical expression of the underlying miasm. In his mind, a practitioner could not treat chronic disease without understanding this principle. Intercurrent treatment. Currently, a theory of treatment exists that has become popular where anti-miasmatic remedies are given intercurrently along with the indicated constitutional remedy. This treatment plan sees a practitioner giving, for example, calc carb as the indicated remedy, the remedy that best suits the presenting complaint, with whatever anti-miasmatic either in between treatments or at the end. If, for example, the homeopath believed the syphilitic miasm was the root cause of the complaint, they may give syphilinum either at weekly intervals or as a single dose at the end to close the case. Even though this method is popular, it is not what Hahnemann intended. All remedies are miasmatic. To Hahnemann, there was no such thing as a specific anti-miasmatic remedy. Any indicated remedy for the treatment of chronic disease was by definition an anti-miasmatic remedy. Hahnemann had ample opportunity to make nosodes like sipholinum and medorrhinum, but instead he chose to employ sulfur, thuya, and mercury. To Hahnemann, believing that chronic disease should receive a remedy separate from the miasm was to miss the point entirely because one was the other. For the remainder of his life, Hahnemann never strayed from his three primary miasms. He never added any more miasms, nor did he take any away. Three was the basis of his system. For years, debate about Hahnemann's chronic diseases continued. Many homeopaths thought Hahnemann had gone too far and that his chronic disease philosophy was nonsense. Others believed and trusted Hahnemann's judgment, even though many could never apply his chronic disease theory practically themselves. Forgetting the miasm, it is fair to say, judging from old homeopathic literature, that the major emphasis of homeopathic prescribing remained rooted in the task of finding the simillimum rather than finding the simillimum that also matched the miasm. The problem is that this way of prescribing takes us back to the beginning of homeopathic research and back to the unsatisfactory results Hahnemann experienced, which prompted the writing of the chronic diseases. A new century, new ideas. The reason for this focus on the simillimum alone is that most homeopaths did not find Hahnemann's conclusions practical or easy enough to put into practice. It was not until the turn of the 20th century that authors like J. H. Allen and Herbert A. Roberts started to put Hahnemann's theory into understandable language, analysing the miasms not only through Hahnemann's writings but also by examining the nature and force of the remedies most suited to each miasm, allowed definite patterns to form. The idea that miasms can also be understood from remedies is seen in books like Roberts, The Principles and Art of Cure by Homeopathy, where the author writes, quote, "If sulfur is the remedy that most clearly typifies the soric classification, so mercury is the closest remedial synonym for the syphilitic." End quote. The direction of disease and remedies. By examining the action of miasmatic remedies, it became clear that each had a specific motion or force. Soric remedies like sulfur push disease to the surface. The action of sulfur is centrifugal because it takes stress or disease that is embedded in the system and throws it out onto the skin and circumference. Thuya is the synonym of psychosis, which means its action displays the characteristic elements of psychosis. To understand one is to understand the other. By examining the action or force of Thuya, we can learn and recognize the force of psychosis. And Thuya has a different action to sulfur because it is not centrifugal and does not push outward. Instead, Thuya is inflammatory and encapsulating. Thuya is known for its warts and tumours as well as for its inflammatory action, especially on the reproductive organs. The force of Thuya is circular motion, not outward motion like Sora, hence all the tumours, warts, fibroids and cysts. Mercury, as stated by Roberts, is the synonym of syphilis. Mercury's action is the force of syphilis, which is why it is this miasm simillimum. The action of mercury is not centrifugal like the outward motion of sulfur and Sora, nor is it inflammatory like the circular motion of Thuya and psychosis. Mercury is ulcerative and degenerative because its dominant action is inward. Leprosy as a disease, like Sora as a miasm, begins internally before proceeding to the skin. This action is what we see when sulfur throws an internal disturbance back out to skin. Psora and psoric remedies are dominant in outward motion, while leprosy is an internal infection that affects and destroys the limbs and periphery. Syphilis, by contrast, begins as a skin lesion before burrowing its way into the interior to affect the bones, nerves, and brain. Mercury had long been known as a specific remedy for the treatment of syphilis, although it took until Hahnemann's time to find an effective yet safe way to apply it. The wanton use of mercury during the 16th and 17th centuries led to one of the biggest medical disasters of all time, where it became almost impossible to tell the difference between who was dying from syphilis and who was being killed by mercury. After the initial contact, a skin lesion appears at the point of contact for those infected with syphilis. In secondary syphilis, lesions appear over many areas of the body. At this stage, fevers and other generalized symptoms can also occur. In tertiary syphilis, granulomas appear, the joints are affected, and in some cases neurosyphilis occurs. Remedies like mercury and aurum are syphilitic because they have the same inward motion and direction as the disease. Disease or motion. There are many areas of difference between homeopathic facial analysis and conventional miasmatic understanding, and one of the main areas of difference is in the definition of exactly what a miasm is. Traditionally, a miasm is seen as the legacy of a past disease that remains influential on an energetic level, even though the actual disease itself is no longer present. It is understandable why this opinion was formed by Hahnemann, and his thinking is logical. If acute disease is caused by an infection, then so too should chronic. This is probably also why Hahnemann chose both syphilis and gonorrhea as the origins of the syphilitic and psychotic miasms. Both are infections that have well-known chronic consequences. The other reason both were chosen was because of the different physical effects each disease created in the body. As we have already discussed, syphilis travels into the interior while psychosis inflames and encapsulates. Hahnemann would have seen these two infectious diseases progress and knew all too well their consequences. For Hahnemann, any chronic inflammatory disease was psychosis in disguise, and any degenerative inward progressing illness was just another name for syphilis. Psora must also have an infectious origin, which is why he regarded leprosy as the initiating disease. As logical as this conclusion appears, it has a number of practical difficulties. The first is the continual recurrence of symptoms, a problem miasmatic treatment is supposed to solve, yet in clinical practice does not. Hahnemann's miasmatic theory may explain why symptoms reappear, but the administration of miasmatic remedies did not remove the tendency for recurrence completely. For many, if not most patients, the indicated remedy did not remove a patient's tendency to relapse, nor did it stop them getting sick with other complaints. The origin of the layers theory. Another explanation had to be found, and that explanation became the layers theory. Layers of chronic disease mean each person has historical sediment due to continual infection and reinfection over countless generations. While the indicated remedy can remove the most influential and uppermost layer of a patient at that particular moment, other layers of predisposing chronic disease remain underneath and rise to the surface as the top layer is removed. In practice, this theory adds little value because the end result is still symptoms and disease. Explaining why a patient repeatedly gets sick is not as important as stopping this process from occurring. Clinical outcomes prior to theory. Homeopathic facial analysis does not subscribe to the layers theory of miasms simply because it does not fit with clinical experience. When theory does not match with experience, it has always been the policy throughout the development of HFA to accept whatever event is repeatedly occurring in favour of any pre-existing philosophy. In the development of homeopathic facial analysis, prior knowledge and accepted beliefs were all put to the clinical test. The only two totally accepted concepts were the simillimum and the infinitesimal dose, because they had proven themselves continuously. Many other aspects of homeopathy, such as the application of miasmatic theory, did not fit into this same tried and tested camp. The philosophy applied during the development of homeopathic facial analysis was simple. Test everything and keep only those practices that prove themselves to be reproducible and effective, and then develop a theory based entirely around these reproducible truths so every practitioner can understand and apply the method for themselves. Accepting what regularly occurs as the only clinical truth has led to a complete revision of homeopathic philosophy, application, remedy grouping, case-taking, pathology, case management, as well as redefining what homeopathy is and how it works. Challenging beliefs. Traditional homeopathy is absolutely littered with hearsay and unchallenged beliefs founded more on personal opinion than in reproducible fact. Many of these theories contradict each other, and yet as a profession we accept them all as equally valid. There are people in homeopathy who rarely, if ever, practice. For them, homeopathy is a way of protesting against conventional medicine. Others see homeopathy more as a course in metaphysics rather than a medical modality. For them, the need for a practical, reproducible system is overshadowed by the search for enlightenment. It makes no difference whether the clinical theory they like actually works and benefits the patient, as long as it supplies them with a feeling of higher knowledge and wisdom. They are achieving what they want, which is personally acceptable but not clinically helpful. HFA is a reminder that it is the job of the homeopath to practice and to be of service to others. We live in a three-dimensional universe where everything material is made of energy and motion. This is the basis of homeopathy. While we never forget that energy and life force are one and the same thing, we sometimes forget that the expression of energy is found in movement and motion. It was stated earlier in regard to the miasms that each miasm had its own force and movement. Psora and psoric remedies push outward toward the skin and circumference, while psychosis and psychotic remedies encapsulate by mucus or inflammation. This is why Medorrhinum has been referred to as the mother of pus and catarrh. Syphilis and syphilitic remedies both have an inward direction. Three questions now arise. 1. What is being pushed out, encapsulated or drawn inward? 2. What is behind these forces or motions? 3. What purpose do they serve? Homeopathic facial analysis does not see miasms as diseases. Instead, miasms are seen as natural forces that move according to their nature. If it is not the disease that is pushing outward, then what is it? In HFA, we believe this force is the action of our immune system rather than disease, which is why the simillimum works. When our immune system is trying to push stress or infection away, it makes sense to double up on the body's effort by giving remedies that have the same action. However, once we begin to see miasms and remedies in this light, a whole new philosophy emerges. The role of the remedy. There is nothing new in the idea that remedies double the body's attempt to heal, but we must also understand where accepting this philosophy takes us. If remedies double our ability to fight, then they are not mimicking the force of an illness. Instead, they are reproducing the action of our immunity and defense. It is not Sora that is pushing disease out to the circumference, but our defense system trying to protect itself. Why would disease encapsulate itself when it is in its best interest to multiply? If we accept that our remedies work by increasing our immunity and defense, then we must also accept that the idea of peeling off layers of disease is no longer a valid 21st century view of how homeopathy works. HFA and layers. It is understandable why Hahnemann attributed chronic disease to prior infection when acute disease always has an infectious cause. Smallpox is caused by a virus, so too is measles, chickenpox and influenza. So it is not drawing a long bow to suggest that chronic disease comes from these same beginnings. We can see this conclusion in passages such as these taken from Hahnemann's Chronic Diseases. Quote, "The gonorrhea dependent on the figwort miasma as well as the above-mentioned excrescences, i.e. the whole psychosis, are cured most surely and most thoroughly through the internal use of thuja." End quote. Thuja was to be given for the chronic disease of psychosis in the same way belladonna was prescribed for the acute disease scarlet fever to remove the infectious cause. While thuja, when indicated, is a great remedy for the treatment of gonorrhea as well as for the chronic after effects caused by its infection, it is a mistake to classify all inflammatory and encapsulating diseases as coming from this origin. Gonorrhea causes inflammation is not the same as all inflammation is caused by gonorrhea. However, this is precisely the mistake that was made, and every day we continue to make it. For symptoms arising after a gonorrheal infection, thuja has confirmed its worth. But in the treatment of the many other chronic inflammatory diseases, this broad blanket approach of a single dose of thuja has not proven successful. Hahnemann himself saw this constitutional approach fail and concluded that unyielding cases such as these must be complicated with Sora, syphilis, or both. This is why the miasmatic remedy was not completing the case. As a result, multi-miasmatic cases have been classed as extremely difficult and sometimes impossible to cure. This explanation of multi-layered chronic disease rationalized the failure of miasmatic remedies, and we have not only unquestioningly accepted this explanation, but have openly built upon it and defended it. Perhaps it is also time that we become open to the possibility that this explanation is wrong. Proving the truth is not as difficult as at first it may seem. What is commonly reproduced and what works is by definition the truth. That human beings have emotions is a truth that is undeniable, not because we can measure emotions, but because emotions form part of our common human experience. When it comes to the layers theory, especially multi-miasmatic layers, successful treatment has not been effectively reproduced as a look in our history books proves. This is why the layers theory should be called into question. History is full of theories that were sacrosanct for decades, even centuries before being proven wrong. Galen's theory on the humours of the body was regarded as mainstream medicine. It was accepted as truth for more than 1,000 years before it was finally overturned. Most of those who think they know better scoff and laugh at these old ideas, but they are also more than likely the ones who would have defended them had they been alive at the time. Openly stating that an accepted idea could be wrong has always been professionally dangerous. However, the reality is the layers approach to chronic disease has not been clinically or even philosophically successful. We know this because of the sea of confusion that currently exists regarding this topic. The fact that so many differing opinions and techniques regarding miasms exist, especially in a profession as small as contemporary homeopathy, is testament to the fact that new ideas and formulas are required to fill a shortfall in the system. Chronic disease is different to acute disease. In homeopathic history, there has never been a theory regarding the treatment of acute disease that has sought to replace the simillimum. This is because there is nothing lacking in the system of treating acute disease. The simillimum for acute disease has proven its worth in multiple epidemics and thousands of clinics for over 100 years. Chronic disease is a different story. Ever since Hahnemann's The Chronic Diseases Weisens, homeopaths have struggled with miasms. Many practitioners today apply the miasms in a variety of different and unintended ways, while even more do not apply the miasms at all. The most common homeopathic practice was and continues to be the use of the simillimum based on symptom totality alone, the very process Hahnemann concluded did not work well enough to use as a system for chronic disease. It is not that miasms have just been misunderstood. Many homeopaths have been diligent in reading and rereading Hahnemann's chronic diseases, but the truth is that Hahnemann was unclear. Even Bonninghausen, one of Hahnemann's closest friends and allies, stated, quote, "The treatment of many chronic cases, the anamnesis of which had before been attributed to Sora, has received another form and far more certainty. Nevertheless, it is on the other hand not to be denied that this circumstance has given an additional difficulty to our practice, as we have not so far any certain signs by which we can distinguish certainly the domain of one miasma from that of the other." End quote. Today, homeopathy has all manner of varying opinions and theories, but they all have one thing in common. Every varying opinion is in regard to the treatment of chronic disease. Chronic disease in all its forms is sometimes successfully treated by homeopathy, regardless of what method or approach is used. Every system has its successful cases that are highlighted to show that particular system's efficacy, but this means little by itself. A case study with a successful outcome does not prove the validity of a system. For a system to be successful, it must be constant in its percentage of success. Historically, homeopathy was at its peak during the epidemics of the 19th century. Homeopathy's success in the treatment of acute diseases such as typhoid, typhus, cholera, and scarlet fever brought it worldwide acclaim. Homeopathy for many became the obvious choice because it was cheap, painless, and effective. Unfortunately, homeopathy has not had the same success in its treatment of chronic disease. In the treatment of acute epidemics, author Julian Winston writes, quote, "One of the earliest tests of the homeopathic system was in the treatment of typhus fever spread by lice. In an 1813 epidemic which followed the devastation of Napoleon's army marching through Germany to attack Russia, followed by their retreat, when the epidemic came through Leipzig as the army pulled back from the east, Samuel Hahnemann, the founder of homeopathy, was able to treat 180 cases of typhus, losing but 2. This at a time when the conventional treatments were having a mortality rate of over 30%. When cholera finally struck Europe in 1831, the mortality rate under conventional treatment was between 40%, Imperial Council of Russia, to 80%, Osler's practice of medicine. Out of 5 people who contracted cholera, 2 to 4 of them died under regular treatment. Dr. Quinn in London reported the mortality in the 10 homeopathic hospitals in 1831 to 32 as 9%. Dr. Roth, physician to the King of Bavaria, reported that under homeopathic care the mortality was 7%. Admiral Mordoinow of the Imperial Russian Council reported 10% mortality under homeopathy. And Dr. Wild, allopathic editor of Dublin Quarterly Journal, reported in Austria the allopathic mortality was 66% and the homeopathic mortality was 33%. And on account of this extraordinary result, the law interdicting the practice of homeopathy in Austria was repealed. Perhaps the most recent use of homeopathy in a major epidemic was during the influenza pandemic of 1918. The Journal of the American Institute for Homeopathy, May 1921, had a long article about the use of homeopathy in the flu epidemic. Dr. T.A. McCann from Dayton, Ohio, reported that 24,000 cases of flu treated allopathically had a mortality rate of 28.2%, while 26,000 cases of flu treated homeopathically had a mortality rate of 1.05%. This last figure was supported by Dean W.A. Pearson of Philadelphia Hahnemann College, who collected 26,795 cases of flu treated with homeopathy with the above result, end quote. Homeopathy's decline. With success rates such as these, the question becomes, why did homeopathy lose its social status? It is true, conventional medicine attacked homeopathy with a ferocity only jealousy can provide, but that has always been the case throughout homeopathic history. Right from the beginning, conventional medicine ridiculed and persecuted homeopathy with venom, which only increased as homeopathy achieved results such as these. But this attack did not stop people from going to homeopaths, and people will patron any modality provided they feel it works. The question is not how conventional medicine beat homeopathy, but why people previously loyal to homeopathy turned to conventional medicine. The answer is multifactorial. For a start, conventional medicine improved dramatically not only in therapeutics, but also in anesthetics, hygiene, and surgery. Civil engineering cleared wastes that before used to lie in the gutters and streets. By the middle of the 20th century, refrigeration and improved transport meant fresh food was available to every first world family, while antibiotics and other wonder drugs, for a while at least, cured acute disease quickly and easily. Epidemics vanished as part of everyday life because epidemics are generally nutrition and hygiene issues solved by increased wealth. Since the end of World War II, the First World has shifted its health emphasis from acute disease and hygiene to chronic disease and surgery. With an increase in leisure time and a society that has accumulated material overabundance, emotional and mental health has also become prominent where previously it was a luxury that time and circumstances could not afford. This shift in the emphasis of community health needs left homeopathy in a precarious position. Acute disease is what homeopathy did best, while chronic disease remained elusive. Now the medical emphasis changed and demanded what homeopathy was least good at. As a result, homeopathy's popularity, which had always relied on the rank and file, began to dwindle to the point of extinction. For other modalities such as psychology, the changing needs of healthcare were beneficial because they could supply what society demanded. Unless a medical model speaks the same language and is needed by the community, it is destined to fade into obscurity. This is precisely what has happened to homeopathy, but it needn't have. To its credit, homeopathy is now trying to catch up and has switched its emphasis away from learning remedies for typhoid and malaria into areas more in demand, especially in the first world. Theoretically, homeopathy should be beginning to rise once again, but this does not appear to be the case. The reason is because we are still applying the same constitutional model as we did before. Some of the names have changed and a number of new concepts have been added, but essentially it is the same old model with a different coat of paint. The basic Hahnemannian model for miasms and the treatment of chronic disease is simple in its design. What is not so simple is how to achieve the results the theory promised. Hahnemann's conclusion and HFA. At its most basic level, Hahnemann's conclusion was that arriving at the simillimum by symptom totality alone was perfectly suitable for acute disease, but it was not suitable for chronic disease. With chronic disease, something extra needs to be included along with the totality simillimum. What is missing is the inclusion of the underlying miasm to be included with the totality of the remedy. Unless the two are included with every chronic disease prescription, the chances of alleviating any chronic disease, regardless of its name, is limited and back to hit and miss. Hahnemann was so convinced his miasm theory was correct, he based his entire hard-earned reputation on it and continued to defend it for the remainder of his life. At this stage, it is important to point out that just because the practical application of the miasm theory has not been clinically successful, does not mean the basic theory itself is incorrect. A method of proving a theory can be incorrect without the theory itself being wrong, and this is precisely what I believe has happened. Hahnemann was right to attribute miasms as the basis of all chronic disease. His mistake was believing each miasm was a disease in itself rather than the body's reaction to disease. Over the course of time, homeopathic philosophy has become increasingly elaborate, trying to defend this position. If the layers theory is going to be accepted, then an array of tributary theories must also be taken on board in order to support it. These offshoot or tributary theories are essential to explain why the central theory doesn't work, while at the same time defending its accuracy as a theory. Homeopathy has developed a number of these alibis whose role is masquerade as a clinical process. The first is the addition of multi-miasmatic remedies to suit multi-miasmatic patients. This means that because every patient has every miasm in them, and so do most of the important remedies, the process of miasmatic individualization once again becomes irrelevant. The next tributary theory is the follow-on remedies. These are remedies that are meant to complete the action of the first well-indicated remedy or to do its job when the well-indicated remedy fails to improve. A frequently employed phrase in old world books such as Clarke's Dictionary. Historically, we should have spent far more time learning to understand that if a well-indicated remedy fails, it was never that well indicated in the first place. Then finding out why rather than justifying why the decision was right, even though the outcome was not. If we base success on what works rather than what should work, a whole new approach to homeopathy begins. It is important to fully understand and commit to memory the following statement: the best, most well-indicated remedy never fails. If a patient does not improve after your prescription, it is because the remedy was wrong. This patient does not need an integrative strategy, they need a new remedy, and that's all there is to it. If, as practitioner, you can begin to measure your results by the black and white target of, is my patient better or not, you will find that homeopathy and how to practice it finally becomes clear. HFA's whole reason for being is to achieve sustainable clinical results and to provide homeopathic simplicity and clarity. And one of the easiest ways this aim can be achieved is to let go of all the speculations and theories that justify why a patient is worse, but I am still right. Intercurrents and antidotes. Intercurrent remedies are another example of homeopathic justification. Intercurrent remedies are theoretically applied when the remedy needs more help, or it doesn't do anything because there is a miasmatic blockage. This theory, like many others when viewed in the cold light of reason, that is, did the remedy work or not, once again falls short. However, this theory not only falls short in results, it falls short on logic. If every chronic disease is an expression of the underlying miasm, as Hahnemann said, then how can we justify the theory of removing the disease in order to get a better remedy to remove the disease? The right remedy works, the incorrect remedy does not. There is no need for intercurrents. Throwing out symptoms. Throwing out symptoms is a contentious issue that many practitioners swear by. If a patient gets worse after a remedy, some practitioners reason it's because the patient is throwing out symptoms due to a deeper underlying layer of disease that has been pushed to the surface because of the remedy. Their theory is that the remedy is peeling off a more superficial outer layer of disease to bring to the fore a deeper, more pathologically savage layer of disease as part of a healing crisis. The no pain, no gain idea. The weakness in this theory is that not only do we have to peel off our own layers, that is, the suppressed and undealt with stresses of our own life, but we must also peel away all the sediment carried into our life from our families. Miasmatic theory now refers to all the diseases and transgressions of the past, not just our own personal history, but the contracted and mismanaged diseases of all the generations who preceded us. This supply of disease is inexhaustible. Viewing the exacerbation of pain and other symptoms as being something healthy and positive is an extension of Hering's law, where older and deeper symptoms are thrown out to the circumference in order to protect vital internal organs. Aggravations. Clinically, I have not seen aggravations to be a great measure of success the way many authors describe. Many of my best and longest lasting cases have come from overall improvement with no aggravation at all. A good remedy creates gentle improvement when delivered in the right way. It is not in the best interests of either patient or practitioner to create misery and suffering if it can be avoided, and it absolutely can. With the HFA process, aggravations are kept to a minimum because it is easier to find the closest remedy, and initial prescriptions rarely go above 30C, which is usually gentle enough except for the most sensitive of patients. Even then, a short aggravation followed by amelioration is still seen. When the concept of chronic disease and miasms shifts from disease to energy, and health and illness is seen as a point of balance rather than an eradication, it becomes clear that an excessive aggravation is a negative response rather than a positive one. While a greater explanation of energy and balance is provided throughout the online HFA course, it is important at this point to understand that when an individual's energy and body is in balance, pain and disease are absent. Conversely, the same applies. When the body, emotions or energy levels are out of balance, pain, emotional turmoil and discomfort increase. Using energy levels and pain as a guide to case management, remedies can be easily assessed as to whether they are having a positive or negative effect. When an energy medicine like homeopathy is administered, its role is to balance personal energy. Pain, behaviour and finally pathology will also begin to balance and improve once energy levels are stable. When we assess only in accordance with the theory that the correct remedy works by decreasing pathology and stabilising energy, and an incorrect remedy does not, then all other theories become irrelevant. Instead of rote learning complicated explanatory systems, prescribing remedies now becomes a straightforward affair where the homeopath has either got their prescription right or they have not. Miasms and motion. In the HFA system, miasms are viewed as a force or motion, not as a disease. As explained, the disease theory for the origin of the miasms has been more confusing than productive, even though the basic philosophy for chronic disease prescribing is accurate. The philosophy that more than just the simillimum is needed for the successful treatment of chronic disease to be accurate applies also to the philosophy of matching the dominant miasm of the patient to the dominant miasm of the remedy. It is only the conclusion of miasmatic origin that is wrong. Have you ever asked yourself why it is important to match the energy of the patient to the energy of the remedy? And if it is the disease that is driving itself inward or encapsulating itself, then how can a remedy that helps this process be beneficial? The fact is that it is not beneficial for a homeopathic remedy to reinforce the action of any disease. However, it would be extremely beneficial if a remedy could double up and reinforce the action of our defense against stress and disease. And this is precisely what happens. Understanding miasms as an action of immunity and defense is to understand the basis of HFA. Matching the dominant miasm of a patient to the dominant miasm of a remedy becomes imperative once a shift in knowledge is made from disease action to the action of self-protection. Increasing a similar energy makes perfect sense when it is in line with protection, not disease. If an individual has a defense system designed by nature to respond to stress by pushing it to the surface, then administering a homeopathic remedy that has an inward action like mercury or aurum could aggravate a patient because it is contrary to how this patient's defense system works. Naming the miasms. Because HFA differs from the disease layer theory of the miasms, disease names are no longer used to describe each separate group. There is no point using syphilis to describe a force of motion that is not related to that particular disease. One cannot hear the term syphilis and not think of syphilis as a disease. As a result, each miasmatic group has been allocated a colour descriptor. Each colour group represents a different miasm. Each primary miasm has been given one of the primary colours. Psora, which is outward motion, equals yellow. Psychosis, which is circular motion, equals red. Syphilis, which is inward motion, equals blue. Miasms and the forces of nature. Every individual has an immune and defense system fueled by one of the three primary forces of nature or one of their combinations. These three primary forces come together to form the basis for the entire material universe. The outward motion of psora, the circular motion of psychosis, and the inward motion of syphilis is the same as the positive charge of a proton, the neutral charge of a neutron, and the negative charge of an electron. Every substance, organic and inorganic, is ruled by and made from these particles and motions combined. Sulfur as a remedy is not psoric because it is infected with the disease of psora. It is psoric because it is dominant in outward motion. Like everything in nature, the strongest force is the one that dominates. Bullies in the schoolyard push the meeker children around, while a determined and forceful personality often makes it up the corporate ladder. Dominant males within many animal groups fight for the sole right to mate, while a dominance in positive or negative force gives a particle or molecule its overall charge. Human beings are governed by these same laws, where the dominant force or miasm, like the dominant male lion in a pride, is the only force that counts. While other forces exist in us all, it is only the dominant force that shapes and governs our actions. There is only one president of a country, one dominant charge in a particle, one dominant male lion in a pride, and there is only one dominant miasm within the body. Understanding miasms as forces or motion makes the task of matching the patient to the remedy vital. This is what Hahnemann was looking for. He knew there was more to the treatment of chronic disease than symptom totality alone. Every homeopath knows once they complete their repertorization based on the totality of symptoms, a range of remedies will be shown. In an average repertorization, there may be between 5 to 20 remedies that are covered by all the entered rubrics. How do we choose one remedy from the other? This is where and how essence prescribing began. Essence prescribing theoretically explained why well-repertorized remedies failed. According to the rules of the simillimum, the task of the homeopath was to match the symptoms of the patient, together with the disease they were suffering, to the symptoms that the proving showed were within those remedies. However, repertorizing proves that remedies are not always interchangeable, and also that many remedies, even those with the needed symptom simillimum, will fail entirely. Okay, that is quite a bit to digest. I am splitting my original essay into two halves and will continue in the next podcast. Next time I will look at miasms as universal forces. Thanks for joining me.
Thanks for listening to Soul and Survival. If you are interested in more information, books, courses, consultations, learning more about facial analysis or life themes, please visit our college site, Victorian College of Classical Homeopathy, vcch.org.